Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Cinematic Realms. I'm your host, John Webster, and with me is my now trusty co-host, Jared Kozel. How you doing, Jared?
I'm doing well, man. We had such a good time last week that you decided to bring me back for a recurring engagement, at such as it were, and talking about something that isn't the galaxy far, far away. Shocker.
Yeah, I think it's not a first. We've definitely talked about stuff that's outside of Star Wars, but this will be the first official thing with the two of us doing this. Oh, hi, Samry. Such a treat to see you. Thanks for stopping by. Great. Now I feel like I was narrowing down my shirts for today, and and now I'm like, damn, I should have grabbed my Samry shirt if I knew she was gonna stop in. Um, but yeah, so today we're talking about the film Braveheart, which I've actually been wanting to do this stream for a very long time because pretty much ever since I first saw the film, and I saw it on home video, I never got to see this in the theater. It's been one of my all-time favorites. And I don't think it's ever really left my top three films of all time. It's sort of circulated in that group for years and years. But what's your history with the movie, Jared?
So I first saw Braveheart probably around the year 2000, 2001, somewhere around that area, which was about 6 years after it came out. I would have been about probably 12 years old at the time. I did not have what you would call the most idealized first viewing experience because, interestingly enough, the way I first saw this movie was uh, we had a setup above the barn where my dad and I would work out and lift weights. And my dad likes to watch movies while he exercises, so we had a bunch of old movies there. And one of them was a VHS, a video cassette. Remember those? Of the movie Braveheart, and it was two cassettes because the movie's so long they had to have a break in the middle. And my dad just threw it on one day while we were exercising, and I kept getting distracted because I was supposed to be focusing on my sets, and I was kept getting drawn into watching the movie. so, and this is on a tiny little screen, which is not really appropriate for a cinematic epic like this. But the story was just so good and so compelling that I couldn't help it. So as soon as I finished that, I'm like, I need to watch this movie for real. And luckily, it turns out it's one of my mother's favorite movies as well. So we sat down and we watched it in full together. And it is it's not the first, but it is one of the first movies that I actually ever remember tearing up at the end over because
Yeah.
it's, I was, 12 years old at the time. At that other, like my cinematic taste had not fully expanded beyond, say, Disney movies and fantasy realms like the tried and true Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. This was one of the first movies. I think Gladiator may have been the first, but this was another one where I was just like so overwhelmed by the power of the story at the end that I found myself shedding a tear. So it's always stayed with me for that reason. Even if the first time I saw it was on a 4 inch by 6 inch screen with that kept fizzling out. So um, that goes to show you the power of good storytelling trumps all.
Yeah, it's funny because when I think about how important uh, the sort of format and presentation of a movie is to me nowadays, with like I all my favorite movies, I want them on 4K Ultra HD with fully remastered picture and sound, and to think that when I guess I would have been 11 years old, um, just a videotape rented from Blockbuster, you know,
Yeah.
was on a on an old TV was, not old by today's standards. At the time, it served me perfectly fine. But that was enough to just get me enraptured in the story. And but funny enough, like I didn't even see the film of my own interest. It was my best friend when I was little. His name is Tim, and I used to go over to his house all the time. We were probably back and forth between playing GoldenEye on N64 and watching TV. Um, Actually, this would have been just a couple of years before GoldenEye, because the game didn't come out until a couple of years later. But we were doing something, maybe playing Mortal Kombat, and I don't know like what, I guess his parents had rented the movie or something, and we just wound up watching this on his TV in the bedroom, and I just sat there transfixed. I'd never seen anything like this because 11 years old, I wasn't a cinephile yet, so, and there were no like epic movies that I had seen, at that time, at least not true epics, like I think the closest thing before this was probably Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, that I had seen. And um, I just remember being so overwhelmed by the power of the story, the characters, the performances. We did get a comment earlier in the chat a few minutes ago. I'm not going to comment on it myself because I want to sort of stay confined to the movie. But Mel Gibson does not have the public standing he had when, at the time of this movie. But if you sort of remove the conversation from that and just focus on his work on this film and his performance as William Wallace, I was enraptured. And I think in the years that followed, especially in the early 2000s, there were a string of epic movies that came out, and we saw that it's not an easy thing for an actor to really drive a movie like this. He did it. Russell Crowe did it in Gladiator, and a few others have done it. But it's not a skill that I think every actor has to be able to pull off a movie like this. And the fact that he directed it as well was pretty amazing. But the entire cast, just this, and it's funny to see faces in this now that I have become very familiar with. I can't believe like how young and cuddly Brendan Gleeson looks in this, and then Sophie Marceau, went on to, she did much more, in her homeland, but she did go on to like do a James Bond film and a number of other things, and just. But I could we'll run down all the characters and the actors who play them, but they're all just utterly fantastic. But the star for me will always be James Horner's music for this film, and this will not be the last time I talk about it because, oh dear God, it's just so powerful. I was the moment that always, like, the music is phenomenal all throughout, but the music that always sticks out in my head is the scene where, like, spoiler alert, it's an almost 30-year-old movie, and we're gonna get right into the thick of it. But when Robert the Bruce betrays William at the Battle of Falkirk, and he's unmasked, and like that whole sequence, no dialogue at all. It's just like James Horner's music just driving that, and you can just see, you can feel the betrayal there and the emotion between those two men, and then as it builds up to when he tries to save him, and has and as Stephen comes in to pick William up and ride off, and then they look at each other, and you know and Robert says go, and then the music just takes over as he just stands there looking on, and that's like a perfectly framed shot, just with him standing there, and the music drives it. And it's funny because that every time I've seen this movie, going all the way back to like that first viewing, that moment of music when it really picks up and the strings are playing, I've always like said to myself, have I heard that music before? And yes, I have. It's a theme that's played throughout the movie, but it almost instantaneously felt like this classic cinematic moment with the music that was already so ingrained in my head that it just felt like that's always been such an emotional scene for me. And so I have bought every iteration of James Horner's score for that. I have a beautiful limited edition from La La Land Records. Yes, I'm plugging them. Go check out their website. Buy the CD. It's still available. But yeah, no, okay. So I've got my initial gushing out of the way. Any comment you have on it? Any of that?
Well, so the first thing I want to do is, among several of our friends who are in the chat, I want to shout out Eric Monroe. He's a good friend of mine, and we connected over on Casterly Talk, which is a Game of Thrones podcast run by Ken Knapsack. Eric is, for those who don't know him, Eric is the world's foremost positive champion of one Stannis Baratheon. So ours is the Fury, my friend. But to focus on what you just said about the score, because there are so many things that we could gush about this movie, I do want to focus on that since it is one thing that you highlighted. I kind of believe that, in order for a movie to truly qualify as an epic movie, as in like a historical epic that we think of with this broad sweeping, usually like almost 3 hours in length, epic movie that really kind of grounds everything in, a way that makes you feel like this is a larger than life story. One of my commandments for such a movie would be it needs to have an equally epic score. And I feel like in this case, James Horner, the late great James Horner, more than rose to the task. He is. This is one of those scores. I think Eric also shouts out in the chat that it's been used in marketing for other movies like Castaway, which is one of the marks of a good score is when people start stealing it for other things. But the reason it's so effective in this movie is it's so well married to the specific emotions of the moment, and you can that takes a true master, because when it comes to how scores are composed, sometimes the composer gets to watch the movie before they start composing the score. Sometimes they just start composing on a feel. I don't exactly know what James Horner's process was for this movie, but whatever it was, he found magic with this particular alchemy of music and emotion and sweeping epic visuals, because I can hear it now, from the way he utilizes the Scottish bagpipes, the outlawed tunes on outlawed pipes, as one of the characters says in the beginning, to the way it brings in those more classical instruments. It truly sweeps you away.
Side note, I don't think Brian Cox ever ages.
Well, he's been 65 years old forever, it seems.
I said to my dad earlier today, I was like, his hair is whiter, and that is all. He looks exactly the same otherwise, which comforts me, actually. because it slows down the passage of time a little bit. Uh, but no, another moment that comes to mind is speaking of his character right before he rides in, the scene with young William and young Moran uh, at the funeral, uh, when she comes back and picks the flower and gives it to him, and Horner's store in that moment. It's another moment without words. And by the way, I really want to applaud the young actors in the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of this film, especially the young boy who plays William. Um, it's not an easy thing to like to find really good child actors and to bring them into something like this. And but he was like so great with his, especially his nonverbal acting, just the looks on his faces and his eyes. A lot of the film depends on that first interaction between these two characters, and the look between them when they're still children, and the tear that comes rolling down his face in that moment with that gesture of kindness that she displays. And Horner's music is just, oh, it's so absolutely gorgeous. It just makes me emotional thinking about it. And yeah, oh god, it's so good.
Yeah, James Robinson is the actor who plays young William Wallace, and I guess I'm not going to pronounce this right, but it looks like Mary Calvi is the young Murren. But yeah, that opening sequence, in like an truly epic movie, oftentimes will show a character at different periods in their life. In some cases, it's not strictly necessary to, go back and see this person when they were a child. In this case, it was because, this is a defining event in young William Wallace's life, the loss of his father and brother, fighting the English after the Longshanks betrayal of the Scottish lords, and the act of kindness he receives from young Murren in that moment before his uncle comes to take him away. Really, you can see how like it left a mark on him, and clearly he remembers it all those years later when he returns, and the idea that he had held on to that one moment for however long it was, 20 years or so before returning, is you can see like the power in that and why it's so effective at capturing Murren's heart when he just I don't know how long he actually courts her, but when the fact he's like, I want to marry you, let's just do it now, and she's like, okay. Which yeah, but I mean, which some people may feel like, oh, that was too fast, but I'm like, that's really not. We don't need to see that to know how much they love each other, because they do it, they capture it so quickly in just those brief interactions, and that is also down to the performance from Mel Gibson and Catherine McCormack, who do a wonderful job just making you believe how much these two characters love each other in the short time they have together before they're tragically.
So. And that's another thing about how effortless so much of the execution of this movie feels with, especially with their love. Bringing up the music again, James Horner's score has a lot to do with that, but the chemistry between them is so utterly fantastic that you only need a couple scenes of them together and your heart is just melting, and you're like, these two are so in love. And it's just something that I have often said this about when I talk about Lord of the Rings, for instance, where there's a magic that happens with certain movies where just the ingredients, they fall into place and it just feels right. And so and so much of that is the case with this movie of, you know, it makes you, especially in those early scenes, it just makes you feel this emotion and this, you know, beautiful, you know, almost heartache, you know, even when it's still happy. Um, you know, it's just amazing. And the really classic movies are able to, you know, they do that in a way that, you know, makes it like, well, why can't we make it work with this other movie? What's missing? And the truth is, it's just sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, no, and I love the initial scene between them when they go out on their first, and that initial scene where she goes off riding with him is just so great. You know, the father's like, "What do you want to have a word with her about?" He's like, "Well," and then she goes riding off, and the mother's like, "It's you she takes after." So great. But then their chemistry in that scene, just as, you know, and when he's talking in Latin and she says, you know, talking about, you know, not nearly as beautiful as you, when talking about, you know, the things that he's seen, and then she's like, "What does that mean?" And he just says, "Beautiful," and she knows exactly at that point what he said. It's just stuff like that. It's just, it makes the heart flutter, and yeah, it's it's so good. And uh, and talking about the flower again, that's like another moment that I love when she unwraps it, and you know, and at first it's not completely like kicking in, and then she looks down again, and then it hits her in that look where she then looks up, and just in shock and surprise and overwhelmed, and that's at the point where, you know, like there's no turning back. That's why she says yes so easily, because you know, it's, you know, that's, you know, it's just that undeniable love that you know, it's beautiful, which just makes it all the more terrible when everything goes downhill. But
no, it's a it's an essential part of the movie, because, you know, the movie is almost 3 hours long, and maybe the opening sequence when they're kids is, I don't know, like 15-20 minutes, and then we have another, like, you know, maybe 15-20 minutes with them together, and then before she is tragically and horrifically murdered, and that but that the memory of that interaction really has to stay with you for the entire 3 hour runtime, and it does, you know, so that when she comes back in dream sequences throughout the movie, you kind of feel that kind of warm, indelible presence that she has, in the way that she's kind of left her mark on him forever. And I know that I would feel remiss if we didn't bring it up. You know, the fact that she, you know, is killed, and that becomes his driving motivation throughout the film. I know that some people will have complicated feelings about that, but the reason that I feel that it is good, you know, a good use of in this movie, is because this is not like this isn't a fictional story. Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, it is a fictional story. People have taken shots at the fact that this movie takes historical liberties, and it does, which we can talk about later. But the fact is that this is the kind of thing that did happen in history, you know. So, and in this case, you know, the fact that his wife was murdered because she refused to submit to sexual assault by a, you know, horrible English soldier, you know, this, like, saying that this is the kind of thing that, like, oh, we can just brush under the rug in a movie like this, that would be doing it more of a disservice, you know. So I personally feel like, even if it is, you know, something that for our more modern and sensitive sensibilities is uncomfortable to watch, and that scene is brutally difficult to watch, it is necessary for us to see it.
Yeah. Even like I said, I saw this movie when I was 11 years old, and it's shocking, maybe even more so to me as I'm older, because I understand, the realities of the world a bit more. And when I was younger, this was just a story. And sometimes you can take comfort in, like, even if it's like based on a true story, this is a, I'll concede it's a highly fictionalized, telling of something that's based on a true story, which, and we can talk about that later, and I'll go into my fervent defense of why that's just fine. But yeah, so it's the yeah, but revenge stories, and tragic love stories are part and parcel with cinema, and especially, and not saying like, if it's not for you, it's not for you, and that's perfectly fine. But especially for a film made in the mid '90s, and this is far from the only, it's a recurring motif, even in Gladiator. We have the same thing where his wife and child are murdered, and so you do often see this as a motif in stories like this. And um, I can say that, it's been almost 30 years, so I'd like to think that we have more variety in our storytelling now. But I still think it works, and I'm a sucker for tragic love stories because it breaks my heart, and and I like feeling pain, apparently. But there is great beauty that comes with that pain as well. Um, and but yeah, speaking of which, I want to step back just for a second, and then we can sort of continue on there. But since I was just about to bring up the revenge sequence where he comes back into uh, the town, and that music in that scene, you were talking about music that's used in trailers, and music from the revenge scene is actually used in the final trailer for the Fellowship of the Ring. So even Lord of the Rings was using Braveheart music in its trailers. So this was back in the day. But by the way, I'm going to make a digression here, and I think I've made this point before, but I really miss the days uh, when studios would use like actual true music from films in their trailers and advertisements. Nowadays, they seem to get like a music company to make like a trailerized version, of like, if it's a franchise, they'll do that. And like we had to endure that with Dial of Destiny, where there was a very trailerized version of John Williams' Indiana Jones music. Pain to my ears, man. Pain to my ears. But these were the good old days for movie trailers. Anyway, so back to the movie. But it's because it's so horrific. It's extraordinarily satisfying when these. We can talk about how the English are portrayed very much as the evil villains in this movie.
Spoiler alert, not well.
Yeah. But it is really satisfying when these characters get their revenge, especially, the husband who's, when the King of England, Edward the Longshanks, which we'll talk about him when he institutes, prima nocta, and it's like you're just waiting for that, English lord to get his comeuppance, and it is very satisfying.
Yeah, I see the Never Never podcast in here that has actually called out that scene where the local lord arrives to claim his right of prima nocta from the young bride, and her husband, played by Tommy Flanagan Morrison, I believe the character's name his name is just, apoplectic, but the way that she kind of so gracefully and silently intervenes and slowly pushes the swords away from his neck, that's such a haunting sequence and such a beautiful piece of acting from an actress who, one, doesn't have any dialogue in the scene, and I feel terrible that I don't have her name on the tip of my tongue, because she leaves incredible impression in just less than a minute of screen time, perhaps.
Yeah, there's so many actors in this movie who have very small parts but have such incredible presence. Yeah. So again, I just want to highlight the casting of this film. It's utterly astounding.
Yeah, and that sequence is so incredibly important because that is our visual impetus for the reason for why William and Murren ultimately decide to get married in secret. We needed to see something like that, and I think that they did that, quite gracefully for something so horrible by just focusing on the young woman she is the one who is going to be violated by this lord, but she is, the epitome of courage in that scene. And the fact that she's having to endure it is horrible. But the fact that her concern in that moment is to make sure that her husband isn't killed for trying to protect her, really kind of makes her almost an angelic figure in that scene, which really, and it also, underscores how terrible this system of oppression that the Englishmen are subjecting the Scots to. It outrages us, and it's meant to outrage us, but it also is, that sequence is beautiful in a very twisted and tragic way. And that ultimately plays into, our fear of wanting to make sure that, that kind of thing doesn't happen again, which of course leads to the tragedy with what happens with Murren, having her throat slit in a horrifying sequence by the local magistrate, and then playing into William's revenge scene, which a couple commenters are calling out as one of the that sequence just builds and builds and builds, and the use of drums from James Horner's score in that sequence, just the fact that they take the time, I didn't time it exactly, but it had to have been well over a minute, possibly as long as 2 minutes, just showing William riding up towards the magistrates with his hands up, and what he's going to do, but they make you wait for it and wait for it and wait for it until the moment when he pulls his weapon out and starts to exact his vengeance on the English soldiers. It is, it truly makes him feel like a force, an almost supernatural force, someone who is more than a man, and you can see how his legend would start to grow from there.
Yes, and imagine a movie having the patience to build up to a moment.
It helps when you have a 3-hour runtime.
Yeah. But even so, by the way, I do want to comment that there's actually a lot that was cut out of this movie, particularly in its third act. There's some very skillful use of some rearranging of montages that helped Gibson get this film down to a 3-hour runtime. But even so, it's it's a film that allows moments to breathe, and it just does it so beautifully. Yeah, no, and then like I said, that's so gratifying, and I've always like, uh, especially when I first saw this when I was like 11 years old. I remember being like, um, so scared when Marin is executed, both for the character who you grow so attached to, but also as an 11-year-old being very like squeamish about violence. And I remember just, you know, being like, we're not really gonna see him cut her throat, are we? And they shy away from showing that. It, but then when you know the the Lord who then gets revenge taken upon him, we see his throat being slit in all its glory, and that's very satisfying.
I mean, this movie is brutally violent. It's one of the movies that I have a vivid memory of remembering just how violent it was. Specifically, the sequence when once William starts to take his revenge and he pulls out his sword, sweeps it low, and just cuts that soldier's leg off, and you see him like fall down and start screaming. I had never seen anything in a movie like that before because I was used to the more sanitized version of like fantasy violence that we often see in in these types of epic movies, because if it's R-rated, then you can't get as big of an audience. And I was 12 years old. I'm technically not supposed to be watching a movie like this, but it it's a wake up call that this is the kind of brutal violence that was real in the world, and that you need to be aware of if you're going to tell a story like this. And I often kind of, we'll talk about this more once we get to the battle sequences. I kind of view this movie as a direct precursor to the kind of battles that we would later see in something like Game of Thrones, something attempting at least to approximate more of the horror of what war is actually like. Because these are humans trying to kill each other. It's easier when in something like Lord of the Rings, where as epic and grand as those battles are, when you have orcs as the enemy, you can get away with a lot more. You can get away with Aragorn cutting that orc's head off with a blood spurt and it still get a PG-13 rating. Not so here. But that it's more effective for that because you actually see the human cost of the brutal battles and that are taking place here.
Yeah, there's something especially brutal about the way that that's portrayed in this movie, and yeah, it does feel like a precursor to. Yeah, I've always said that the battle scenes in Game of Thrones seem very much inspired by both this film and I think Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven as well. Especially Battle of the Bastards is very much Kingdom of Heaven. But a key difference for me is the fact that Game of Thrones is very much made in the digital age, shot digitally, digital effects, and so there's almost something that, even though we saw a lot of graphic violence in that, there's something about the fact that this was made in the analog era that makes it feel all the more brutal. And another thing I wanted to highlight is this really does feel like it was probably like the last old age epic. That, like, when I was watching the battle scenes, I'm like, holy crap, the number of people they assembled for these battle sequences, because you weren't doing like digital doubles, or stuff like that. This was well before the days of the massive technology that they deployed in Lord of the Rings. And even before Gladiator, when they were you know, using digital extensions for like crowds and stuff like that. You get like some matte paintings, you know, in this movie occasionally, but so much of it is just shot for real. And so I was like, man, this really is an epic of another time, you know. And because of that, the violence, I think, the fact that it's so in your face and so gruesome, just feels all the more like shocking.
Mhm.
And even being older and having seen lots of stuff, I was watching those sequences and like, you know, legs getting chopped off, heads getting chopped off, heads getting smashed, you know, and I was like, dear God, it's great. You know, I think it really aids the movie in terms of its, you know, um, what's the word I was looking for? Um, I don't know, but it just really makes it all so impactful. And but yeah, I was like, and the movie, like, the movie is beautifully shot, but there is something, like I was saying, it's pre-digital, so it feels almost more, I don't know, earthy than a lot of modern epics do, where everything is like pristine and,
Mhm.
you know, and perfect. This feels like, you know, they got, you know, if they got mud on the lens, there wasn't going to be any touching up of it or anything. Um, but yeah, uh, very gruesome.
Yep. Shout out to John Toll, the cinematographer, doing, you know, this is this is a movie. I totally agree with what you were saying about this feeling like more of a classic epic. It feels almost kind of like a bridge, whether it's the last of the old great historical epics or one of the first of the, you know, the newer age, because, you know, it does feel a lot of times in its scope something more like a Ben Hur or a Lawrence of Arabia than it does to something like a Braveheart or a Lord of the or a Gladiator or a Lord of the Rings or something along those lines. But obviously, the filmmaking techniques are more advanced, have advanced, and they can get away with more in terms of the actual scale of the violence. Um, and it is a truly impressive feat of practical effects and camera work, as Guilty Undertaker notes, and as Eric notes. You know, like when you see the horses, you know, suffering in this movie, like you feel you almost feel like you have to question that no animals were harmed in the making of this film that they have to put at the end of every movie, because you feel terrible when you see the horses get impaled on these, you know, wooden stakes. Obviously, they weren't really hurt, but they it's impressive that they were able to make it feel that real and that um, savage when they were limited by the amount of tools that they had. But sometimes limitation is the inspiration for innovation, and I think that they managed to do that here.
Yeah. By the way, like, when we get around to talking about Kingdom of Heaven, uh, it will the
Oh,
guilty. It will be the director's cut,
oh yeah,
because that is,
that is one of the few director's cuts where you can legitimately say it is a totally different movie and an infinitely better
yeah.
one.
Um, and it's funny because another digression, but I just can't help talking about Kingdom of Heaven when it's brought up. But it's funny because the original movie, because it's not as involving as the director's cut. The characters aren't as interesting. So the theatrical cut actually, to my mind, feels like a much longer movie. And I remember when the director's cut came out and people were like, "Oh God, I can't stand the thought of watching a longer version of that." And I'm like, "Yeah, but you'll be more interested." in this version, because it's just like you can't believe the stuff that they cut out of that movie.
Yeah, and
But
a good movie can never be too long, and perhaps a bad movie can never be too short.
yeah. So anyway, but we'll definitely get to that because that's another favorite epic of mine. Um, although I do want to comment on this, he was in the movie in both versions, and one of the better parts of both both versions of the movie. But anyway, so we'll get around to that at a later date. All right, so we've been kind of all over the place. So
I mean, we've still pretty much only talked about the first, like not even third of the movie. There's just so much here.
I do want to shift over because it'll allow us to talk about some things that perhaps I think will be a bit more critical of, because times have certainly changed in the past 30 years, and we're a bit more. I think we've progressed a bit, hopefully, and that's switching over to our the King of England, a very nasty, King Edward the Longshanks. Fantastic performance by let me see if I'll get his last name right, Patrick McGoohan.
I'm glad you said it rather than me, because
McGoohan.
He's excellent though.
But he is just like, and he says the most despicable things, where he's like, the trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots.
I was just thinking of that line. It's such a
and it's horrifying. What it leads to is absolutely, horrifying. But like his delivery of it, you can't help but like, it's such a great performance because he's so despicable, but acting wise, he's so great. And then you have Sophie Marceau as
Isabella,
Isabella, who, like, full disclosure, I've been in love with Sophie Marceau since I saw this movie. She's just absolutely
you have good reason to be so. She's quite beautiful and quite a great actress in this film.
Yeah. There are some issues with this side of the movie, with the way that the prince is portrayed, as well as his lover, unfortunately. And I don't know how much I was aware of what was sort of not great about this depiction when I was 11 years old, but as I've grown older, I've become more and more aware of, it's not great.
Anytime we talk about a movie, we have to say, it's a movie of its time. And in this case, it really is a movie of its time. This is a time when depicting homosexuality on screen was something that they tended to do it via allusions and, like indirect, asides without showing anything. And in this case, it's doubled down because, not only are they alluding to the fact that the prince is gay, they also are, he's weak. He's kind of an effete, sniveling villain who can't really stand up for himself. It's interesting. Like, I don't know if you've seen the movie Outlaw King, which is the movie about Robert the Bruce starring Chris Pine. The Prince Edward II actually is a character in that as well. And in that one, he is actually portrayed more as the main villain, the main antagonist. Okay. And you kind of get the sense of, and Longshanks is a smaller character because Robert the Bruce ended up having more of a direct rivalry with Edward II as opposed to Longshanks. But you kind of even get the sense of that in the movie because once Longshanks murders the prince's ostensible lover, you would think that would drive him away, but you kind of start to see him bring the prince more into the, his orbit. He becomes colder and crueler, and you can see how Longshanks is starting to shape him more in his image. But that just kind of, again, doubles down on the idea that the prince, as depicted in this movie, is a very weak character, and unfortunately, like, that's not great representation. I personally feel that, like, the character himself, like, not all gay characters need to be portrayed heroically, but unfortunately at this time, when in the filmmaking industry, there weren't a lot of examples of heroic gay characters, and so he kind of plays into all the worst stereotypes. And I agree that it's an element of the movie that has not aged well. But I do feel like it serves its purpose for the narrative, because obviously our sympathies are meant to be with the queen, with Isabella, because the prince is not only not interested in her, he Longshanks treats her quite cruelly and uses her, and there's the implication that he might be looking to impregnate her himself. And so we obviously it's all meant to kind of lift her up and kind of suggest her why she might be so interested and compelled by William Wallace. But again, this is the kind of thing that if this movie were made today, they would have made it differently, because it doesn't hold up to our modern sensibilities. And I just happen to be more acknowledging of that, while also freely admitting, it's not a great depiction on that.
Yeah, I've struggled with it. It doesn't ruin the movie for me. This is still one of my favorite films of all time, but it's a black mark on it, unfortunately. I wish they had done better. But one light positive thing I will say about it is I think the performance of the actor who plays the prince, he has some really good moments. I think acting wise, he does a great job. It's just the portrayal, and from a writing standpoint and story standpoint, that unfortunately isn't good. So yeah, I do want to be honest about that, because I know I have a reputation for liking everything and defending everything, but this is one thing where I'll be like, yeah, it's not good. But yeah. So
yeah, it is what it is for this time. I'm strongly of the opinion that if movies are made in the time that we they're made in the time that they're made, and we're watching them today through modern sensibilities. But I strongly believe that depiction does not always equal endorsement. And in this case, it's an instance of just what people could get away with in this time frame, and unfortunately, perhaps sensibilities that have not evolved quite as much as they have now. So it's something. Put it this way: it is not something that will cause me to think that this movie should be discarded, because it is a great piece of art in its own. But it is an incredibly fair criticism to level at the movie, looking back, as something that, it was a movie of its time, and it's also something that if you tried to do exactly the same thing now, you would be rightly favoring. So
yeah, and I was about to say something now. I can't remember, having a senior moment. But yeah, no, it's just, yeah, I mean, there's no getting around it. It's just, it is what it is. It doesn't ruin the movie for me. I still love this film dearly, but I wish they had done this differently. And but it belongs, unfortunately, to it's part of the thing of, like, and this is not defending, like, they should have known better even I think a lot of us should have known better in the 90s. I was only 11 years old when this movie came out, so I'm not going to be too hard on myself. But the fact that I didn't really bat an eye as a kid to this sort of speaks to the larger societal, views on homosexuality, and and the way, like, what stands out to me is the way I remember the audience responding to those scenes, and it wasn't always great. Uh, I recall laughter at several moments, and that's you know extremely unfortunate.
Mhm.
And I think the way that um, I I want to make sure that what's I think was the character's name Philip. Is that
That was the lover. Yes.
yeah? The scene where he's killed by the cane. It's staged in a very, like, it's meant, I think, to elicit laughter.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, it's, well, I guess I had no way around it. It's not great. There were, like, I think there was a way to portray the princes as weak that
Hmm.
didn't bring in this story element, or to portray him as gay but not being weak, and having, like, real much better character development, and not just making these characters sort of stereotypes. um but yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, just to wrap up this part of the discussion, I will say that so this was, at least as far as I can recall, the first time I ever saw a gay character depicted in the movie, and obviously it is not a good depiction or any kind of positive reflection of that of people who identify as gay. But it also is like one of the ways we've come further is that this is what, when people talk about representation, they are talking about more opportunities for people to tell stories, so that one depiction of something like this does not define that idea about what it is for a gay man in popular culture. Because in this case, I do not believe that all gay characters should be depicted as heroes or saints or morally flawless. The fact that the prince is a weak and arguably evil character, and also is gay in this movie, like, that does not necessarily need to be a a fatal flaw. It's the fact that that's all that there is to him in this movie, and that he was one of the only depictions of a gay character in art at this time, and so it stands out more. But again, it's not a fatal flaw for the movie. It's not something that hindsight is 2020. And I feel like it should be a learning experience for people going forward, not something to quote unquote cancel this movie.
Yeah. I think Cassie, summed it up. It's a sign to show that I know sometimes we get discouraged about the state of things, and should be. But I think it's good also to recognize that we have come a ways. I hope. I think we have, and hopefully we'll continue on that road. Anyway, so I just want to make sure that we set some time aside to discuss that, because I think it's important. When praising so much about the rest of the movie, I just wanted to give that its due. But that's also, I think, before we launch back into the rest of the movie, this is probably a good moment, even though this may not exactly be the midpoint, considering where we are in the discussion. I'm going to go ahead and do the mid-roll here. For people watching for the first time, don't go anywhere. We're obviously not done, but just going to give a preview for what's coming up next week. And then, Jared, if you have anything you want to, get out there, and you're more than welcome. Next week, we're going to be having our wonderful friend and fellow Knight of Kira, AR, is going to be joining us for a 20th anniversary celebration of Pirates of the Caribbean. We will mostly, I think, be focusing on Curse of the Black Pearl, which celebrated its 20th anniversary this year. But I think we will inevitably dip into the rest of the trilogy. And there weren't any more after that, right? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, there were, but I know what you mean. This is the first three are a classic, are classics of modern popular culture, and the last two have some problems. So.
Yeah, and even like I would argue, look, we love the original trilogy for a variety of reasons, especially one that we're going to get into next week. But I do also feel like Curse of the Black Pearl is the classic one. Yeah. It's the one that is like, I'll go and say I think it is the best, and it's we love the other two, but they do have their flaws. Curse of the Black Pearl is just a bona fide classic popcorn movie that is just exceptional. So, and yes, there have been multiple Pirates of the Caribbean streams on this channel, but damn it, I'm using the 20th anniversary as an excuse to go back in. And you weren't here for those previous discussions, so we're gonna have a blast doing that, and once again going on and on and on and on about how amazing the star of these movies is, Keira Knightley. So look forward to that next week, and then what did we? And then the week after that, we're diving back into Ahsoka with a discussion of parts 3, 4, and 5. So yeah, and then we'll let you guys know what's going on after that. But yeah, you have anything you want to get out there or talk about what we got coming up? Or
nope, I'm excited for our lineup. I'm particularly excited for next week's Pirates stream, where we can all celebrate what we can now officially call a classic movie now that it's 20 years old, and to have AR with us for that will be special. Knights of Kira reunite.
Yeah, which, by the way, for those who don't know what we're talking about, if you just started watching this and you're like, what on earth are these weirdos talking about? We do have our we'll call an unofficial, but heck with it, we'll say official fan group of one Miss Keira Knightley, and we call ourselves the Knights of Kira. You can find us on Instagram, and soon to be on Blue Sky, and that other site that used to be called Twitter. But yeah, so every once in a while we're going to have discussions on this channel that will be branded Knights of Kira discussions, all in praise of our amazingly talented and beautiful goddess. So so yeah, next week it'll be Pirates of the Caribbean, and then who knows what the future holds. I think we're due an atonement discussion as well. So aside from that, yeah, no, and nothing much. Just I want to thank you guys for for watching it. I know this channel has been sort of off and on for a while now, but I feel like we're getting into a groove now, and I think we'll be going pretty consistently every week. So if you're a new viewer and you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. and check out stuff that that we've done in the past. One of my earliest streams was Jared and I did a great discussion of Pride and Prejudice, which is still one of my favorite streams that we did.
It's my favorite still.
Yeah, and and of course for people who haven't who again are new, I always feel inclined to direct you towards a stream that I did a couple years ago with a fellow by the name of Doug Adams. No, not that Doug Adams. With the author of the book, The Music of the Lord of the Rings films, who has worked closely with Howard Shore. I had a wonderful 3-hour discussion with him about Howard Shore's score to The Lord of the Rings, and it's one of my favorite things that I've ever done. And yes, I will brag, I got retweeted by Sir Ian McKellen when I did that. So, because damn it, I'm going to brag about that to the end of my days, because I think, if you can't brag about that, then what can you brag about? So check that out and see, and that just, yeah. That warms my heart. So anyway, I think that about wraps up the mid-roll. So let's go ahead and get back into the movie. Another cast member that we haven't really talked about yet, cast member and character, is Angus MacFadyen, who plays Robert the Bruce, who is amazing, and he is one of those actors that it really annoys me that he did not turn into a bigger deal post Braveheart, because he is so good in this.
No, he is outstanding in a role that has its challenges, because he is in some respects, you're designed to be frustrated with his character, but you just can't help but liking him because he comes across as someone who clearly does have a heart in the right place, who is courageous, who is the man, as they say, who could be the King of Scotland, as he ultimately becomes. And I just feel like Angus MacFadyen does such a wonderful job of making you feel that character's inner torment and like longing and desire to belong to something bigger. The scenes that always stick out to me are one, the scene where he makes his pitch to William Wallace that they need the nobles if they're going to prevail, and William gives him that speech about how you're the right, if you would just lead the people to freedom, they'd follow you, and so would I. And that's a fantastic line, but the look that Angus MacFadyen's Robert the Bruce gives after William Wallace gives him that piece of inspiration, it's just so good. It's such a great piece of acting. And then there's the scene later in the movie where he's talking to his father, and Robert kind of gives that speech about what William Wallace has that he envies, in a sense, because he has all these lands and titles and the favor now of the King of England, but he's like, it means nothing. And the way he says the words, I want to believe as he does. So good. Such a great,
It's so good. And by the way, Robert the Bruce's father, played by the great Ian Bannon, who is like been I can't like spot specifically things that he was in other than this, but I know I've seen him in like countless older films, and like he's such a great actor, and even behind the makeup of his leprosy, it's like he gives such a great performance to where like you hate the guy, but also something that came across to me this time, maybe it's because I'm older, is that he actually really is doing what he feels he needs to do to protect his son and to secure you know, his future and getting the crown for his son. So he's not like, when I was little, I would have called him like a villain, but he's not really. He just makes, choices that are, obviously not in alignment with, where our loyalties are as the viewer. But I think he's doing, he cares for his son. So he's trying to do right by him. But of course, by the end of the movie, he, gives Wallace over to the English, so we hate him, and so does the Bruce. It's just such a great final exchange. At last, you know what it is to hate, and now you're ready to be king. My hate will die with you.
Yeah. I personally, I don't know what you're feeling. I think Angus MacFadyen probably gives the best performance in this movie, like individual performance. But his father, you said Ian Bannon is the actor who plays him. He's up there as well, because he does so much with such a limited role. He never leaves that room. But the impact that he has on the events of the story is it's an incredibly influential and important character. And I totally agree. He is not a villain in the classic sense, not like Longshanks is in this movie. He is doing, as we would say, you could say he's doing the wrong things for the right reasons, or the right things for the wrong reasons. But I'm honestly not sure, like, if I were to look at this from a more removed perspective, where my sympathies are not so firmly ingrained with William Wallace, I could see him, feel like he has a logic to his character. He's not just a mustache twirling villain. He has, as you say, he cares about his son. He's trying to do the best as he can for his son and his family. He is doing what he thinks is right. And that classic adage about a good villain is the hero, of their own story. I think that applies, even if I wouldn't necessarily even call Robert the Bruce the Elder a villain in this traditional sense. He is an antagonist in this, and obviously he is the one who ultimately brings about William Wallace's end. But he is like, his character makes himself feel like a real person rather than a cartoon antagonist, as some of the, say, English nobles come across as.
And actually, he would be right at home in as a Game of Thrones character.
Yes, he would.
As someone who is doing what he thinks is right for his family, and who might come across as an antagonist to us, the audience, but in his mind, he's doing what's right, or at least what's smart. Because that's the thing. It's like, we have to remember that not, characters in a story aren't watching the story. He's not getting the Blu-ray of following the adventures of William Wallace. So from his perspective, he's like, what are you doing, wanting to go off and follow this guy? But and Eric just brought up Campbell, played by
James Cosmo, the fantastic
James Cosmo. Like I said, what a cast. Another actor who feels like he's always looked the same. Although he does, he's more grizzled now, and we get a younger and older version of him in this movie.
Like Brian Cox, he's another actor who feels like he's been the same age forever. But he's excellent in this movie. His relationship with Hamish, his son, played by the equally wonderful Brendan Gleeson, is outstanding. He has what I arguably think may be the funniest moment in the entire movie when he's injured by that arrow, and he's drinking. He's like, "What are you waiting for? Pull it out!" And then Hamish looks at him fearfully. And he's like, hands the spear to Morrison. It's like, "Here, you do it. I'll hold him down." And then Morrison grabs some rando. It's like, "Here, you do it. I'll hold him down." And then, of course, he breaks the jaw of the guy who ultimately does cauterize his wound. But he's a larger than life character who he's a ride or die kind of guy, and both he and Brendan Gleeson's Hamish are wonderful as William's kind of trusted lieutenants, along with the fantastically entertaining character of Stephen, played by David O'Hara as the insane Irishman.
Which is so great because David O'Hara is one of those actors who has very much changed since he was in this movie. He has a much, like, I don't know how to explain it, much deeper, like, more gravelly voice, now and even like 10, 15 years ago. But in this movie, he's his voice is so light and he's so fun, and just, I'm sorry, but it's still one of my favorite moments. I didn't like him anyway. He wasn't right in the head. And we're not on my island, more's the pity. Your island? You mean Ireland? Yeah, it's mine.
Yeah, and also during the battle when they're getting rained on by arrows, he looks over at William. He's like, "The Almighty says he can get me out of this, but he's pretty sure you're fucked."
So great. And then that's the thing. Like there is so much, as much tragedy and heartache, as there is in this movie. There's some great humor, and a lot of it does come from his character, and from Hamish as well, especially earlier in the movie. I love when he challenges him to the rock throwing competition, and then William gets him with the small one.
Should have remembered the rocks.
Oh, you should have. God, yeah. And that's the thing. That's what makes this like movies shouldn't, like, even with, like, this is serious subject material. It's a big epic story, but you have to have those lighthearted moments to bring you out of it, and just so you crack a smile. Even small moments, like again with Stephen, where he towards the end of this movie, when Wallace is going off to meet the Bruce, and he goes, "I see you after." And to himself he goes, "Sooner rather than later, I hope." Which is actually ingenious because it really disarms you, and that's the type of like script moment where you're like, maybe it'll turn out okay, because he's making a joke about it, and then of course it doesn't. But we'll work back up to that. But yeah, and I just want to highlight, we were talking about Brendan Gleeson. This was, it's hard to imagine that this was the first thing I remember seeing him in, and he has just become such an astonishing actor. All the way to, we've been talking about doing a stream about the Banshees of Inisherin, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point soon. And just like, which side note, the on-screen exploits between him and Colin Farrell, between that movie and In Bruges, just, I love. Good thing about Banshees of Inisherin is I think we'll be able to talk more in depth about that than when I did a stream on In Bruges, because there is so much that is like that you just can't repeat from that movie. It's so wrong on so many levels, but it's hilarious. But I just couldn't like. I was like, yeah, I'm not going to say the dialogue from that film. So anyway, when we get to Banshees, I think we'll have a great conversation. But Brendan Gleeson, he's pretty much been in every epic movie you can imagine, and he's done some great performances in like smaller independent films, and and he's Mad Eye Moody too. So he's done everything. So, but he's so great in this. Yeah, Kingdom of Heaven. He's in that too. That's what I'm saying. He's pretty much called upon to do absolutely everything. But yeah, speaking of him and his father, like a moment that stuck out to me, and there were a lot of moments that hit me harder now than when I was younger, and I think this comes up for me a lot when movies dealing with loss, especially loss of parents. Given that I just lost my mom last year, it's a lot of stuff hits me hard, and in the moment when his father dies, I was really hit by the look on William's face, because I think more than when I was a kid, I recognize that this is a moment of William's gone through this. He's lost his father, and so it's a moment of him, like he knows the pain that Hamish is going through, and yeah, it's just it's so powerful. And I love their relationship, and it's sort of heartbreaking that their last exchange is an argument.
Between William and his father, yeah. It's the kind of thing where if you don't get that closure for losing someone who's that close to you, it will haunt you for years, if not the rest of your life. By contrast with Eric Monroe's calling this out in the chat as well, like the scene where Hamish, is watching his father slowly die. That is a wonderful example of a character actually getting that closure that he needs from his parent, because Campbell has kind of been pretty hard on his son throughout the movie, calling, joshing him. He's a very strong, overbearing father figure. There's the scene where he shouts out "idiot boy" when Hamish tries to help him earlier, but he loves him. And that scene where Campbell is dying and he tells his son, and Hamish is just like, "No, you're going to live." And Campbell has the wonderful line of, "I've lived long enough to live free. Proud to see you become the man you are. I'm a happy man." That is like such a wonderful piece of dialogue that tells you everything you need to know about that character and his relationship with his son and everything he's fought for his entire life. And it's powerful in that sequence.
I want to thank you, Eric, and my sympathies, because I know that it's only been a year for me, but I suspect that the pain I feel isn't going anywhere. So I imagine after 4 years, and probably longer than that, it still feels pretty raw. So all my love and support to you. I wish I had gotten the kind of farewell that Hamish gets in this. I lost my mom to dementia, and that's not what this stream is about, but I would counsel anybody who goes through that, if I can give one piece of advice, make time for that conversation early on. I didn't, and that's very haunting to me, that I still got to be there with her, and by the end, like she still knew who I was, but I wish I had that conversation where you can actually say goodbye properly. So anyway, sorry, don't mean to
Don't
get
apologize.
all sad with this, but yeah, so it scenes like that are very powerful to me because you kind of wish you could have a moment like that. And also I was hit by earlier in the film, backtracking to oh, I'm so sorry, Christine. uh,
Sorry.
yeah, it's it sucks. It really, really sucks. And I know, like, the time after that, like immediately after, it's terrible because you've got a pain that you can't quite express, and it's like it's almost like you can't let it out. And it's so just be patient with yourself, Christine. And if you need to talk to anybody, um, you know, go ahead and reach out, and um, especially on the Here Be Dragon Slack, we're all there for you. But uh, back to what I was going to say, a moment that really stood out earlier in the film, in the first sequence of the movie, with when uh, when William's father and brother have gone off to battle, and the men are coming back, and sorry, and William notices that he can't see his father and brother standing with them, and he turns around and sort of goes about his morning work, and that hit me so hard because it's that wanting to not, like, if he can delay just for a couple moments the fact that he has lost his father and brother, like he's going to do that. And it's like, and I'm going to get technical for a second and sort of uh, get all geeky with like widescreen versus pan and scan conversation. When I first saw this movie, it was obviously on VHS and it wasn't in the full widescreen format. And with the way this movie is cropped, you can't tell that William has turned around and isn't looking at them. It actually, I thought he was facing the opposite direction. So when I saw this film in widescreen for the first time, which was probably on DVD, it completely changed the entire meaning of the scene, where he was purposely like turned away from them and not wanting to face what he knew to be uh, the truth in that moment. And then when you hear, William, come here, lad, and he turns around and walks away, it's so gut wrenchingly sad. Um, and so moments like that definitely hit me harder now. Um, but yeah, we're trying to get us out of this, so I'm just not crying for the whole rest of the stream. Uh, so we were talking about, um, oh yeah,
Oh
yeah,
God, yeah.
and that actually leads me into something else I wanted to talk about. Like, I'm much better now that I'm older at picking out like parallels between scenes.
Mhm.
And there's two moments with William and Marin that I really wanted to highlight, which is obviously I couldn't help thinking about drawing the connection between the way Marin is lying there after her death at her funeral, and sort of the parallel with William laid out on the cross at you know at the end of the film, and then also looking out towards her reminded me of another scene earlier on when they've gotten married in secret, and and he's just kind of, moving through the crowd and, looking at her from, across the way. And that's very similar to then when she appears at his death scene, and they're looking at each other through the crowd there, which, that stuff would not have occurred to me when I was like 11 years old, watching this movie.
It's a very effective.
Yeah.
It's a very effective cinematic use of cinematic language and camera movement to convey, emotion and connection between these two characters. Even after Murren's death, they are still bound together, and you feel her presence throughout the movie because of scenes like that.
Yeah. Oh. It's so good. And, even the scene where he's, dreaming of her, and, and it's so quick, right? It's like, I'm dreaming, and she goes, yes, you are. And now you must wake. I don't want to wake. I want to stay here with you, and I with you. But you must wake, William. Wake up. Oh God, it's so. And again, bringing back James Horner's music, during the scene, it just absolutely makes it. Which then, I guess we could go into any part of the movie. We talked a little bit about the battle scenes and the gruesome nature of that, but I do think we have to talk about the Battle of Stirling, which is just, and yes, historical inaccuracies. I know that, these battles are not what what they were in history. But damn it, I insist that, movies are great big lies anyway, because the actors' profession is lying to you.
Yeah.
They're pretending to be people they're not. So, so putting aside the historical inaccuracies and the fact that this is the story that the movie is telling, it's so utterly brilliant. Just, there's a story to be told even just inside of that whole sequence, just with, the English, general on the other side, and, and the negotiator, and, the nobles, and then, William arriving, and the two, like, are, the two ordinary soldiers, one of whom is played by
Peter Mullen. Yeah.
Peter Mullen, who was in Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power,
Yes.
as
During the Third.
He's such an incredible actor, and this was, again, first time I saw him in anything, and I've always recognized him ever since. This, like, he and the other shorter guy, they're so great together. The guy's like, William Wallace can't be. He's not tall enough.
Yeah. Yeah, they're. I mean, it's not exactly. They are kind of the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of the movies in a lot of ways. But they don't die, so that's they're there at the end.
So yeah, and can't say enough about, like, it's interesting what you said before about, even though this does feel like the last of the old epics, it is also like you said, it's almost the first in a line of new epics. It's a really good transition point, and I think what we get here is the pre-battle speech that has become such a trope, in films, and but only because Mel Gibson does it so spectacularly. In this, just you can't help but be inspired, and like, take another drink. James Horner's music, building up throughout his entire speech, and they can take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom. It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah, you can draw a direct line between this speech and Aragorn's speech to the armies of men at the in front of the Black Gate and Return of the King. They're very similar in their spirit and their delivery, and in the degree of emotion that you inspire, that inspires you to face a battle against overwhelming odds and win, as they do.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny, like everybody, and it's funny, draw the parallel between, this and Aragorn's speech at the Black Gate. It's very much so, but I think every actor who has had to deliver, a battle speech in the past 25 years has cursed Mel Gibson just for his setting a standard that nobody can really live up to.
Well, it's like one of those things where it's become a trope, and then if you go back and you watch this movie, if you never saw it and you watch it, you're like, oh, that's such a trope, and it's like, it's partially a trope because of this movie. Because it set the stage so well. So if you don't watch things in order, then you might feel like it's a little dated. But I'm firmly of the opinion, not all tropes are bad. Some tropes become tropes because they work, and they keep working.
Yeah, I mean, I'll never be able to have an objective view of of this, this battle speech, because I got to see this, even though I didn't see it in theaters. I did see it when it first came out on video. So I saw this at just the right moment. So like, I'll never see this as anything but like that original, new epic, battle speech. And yeah, and then the stuff with, the fact that they, Wallace and his men ride in with their war paint, and it's so great when he goes up to, negotiate the English representative, and it's so great, he tells him that his commanding officer, ride back to England and, stop at every Scottish village to beg forgiveness for, 100 years of theft, rape, and murder, he says, and then caps it off with, but before we let you leave, your officer must present himself, before this army, put his head between his legs, and kiss his own arse.
I also love the cut back to the English ward after the commander rides away to deliver that message, and you can see him just seething. He's like, "Insult bastard! I want this Wallace's heart on a plate."
Oh God, so good. And then of course the flashing. The Scottish
that I maybe could have done without, but it is fun.
I will say, I have to say this as an editor, even though there's a lot of good editing in this movie, but I did spot some repeated shots in the battle, specifically when the arrows are being fired. It's fine. It's still a great sequence, but but it's funny because I don't know what how many studios financed like reshoots back in this time. I don't think it became like a regular thing until later on, but I'm guessing that they just had to make do with the footage that they had, and they were probably short a couple like shots of arrows hitting people, and they were like, oh, hopefully people won't notice.
Call up CinemaSins, #movie ruined.
No. Oh yeah, it completely ruins the movie. God, it can't enjoy it now. But I just thought that was funny. But it's effective because when I was younger, I never noticed it. So. Yeah. But it's got to be hard when you got a sequence like this. It's not like you can easily go back and assemble, extras for a sequence like this, and it's just and this was what I was talking about earlier. The reason why this does feel like, you know, an age gone by of movie making is that they had to bring in all these extras. And I think I read that, it was a lot of military people, which I think you would expect. It's not the new days of where, you get a smaller group of people for like the medium shots and then fill the rest in, with digital extras. They had to bring in all these people, and you're not going to see anything like that in modern movie making. It's so when you see it in this, it's just absolutely astounding.
Yeah. No, it's they what they managed to pull off given the technology of the time, and for it to still look as good as it does almost 30 years later, that's a testament to the filmmaking craft. Like this is a movie that at least in terms of its filmmaking has and will, as in my opinion, continue to age beautifully, even if there are certain elements of it, as we talked kind of hinted at earlier, that might be more dated. The movie itself is a technical craft piece of art that will endure, I believe.
Yeah, no, it's just beautiful, and I did get to watch the film in 4K today, and it's definitely like a 90s movie shot on film. It doesn't look like, it's what I talked about earlier, where it very much looks like a film of its era. And that's good. I'm glad they didn't try, and a lot of films that get remastered these days, have like different color timing, and they, clean up some stuff. The movie looked exactly as it did back in 1995, which is as it should be. And but it was just beautiful to watch, because the colors were beautiful, and just it was astounding. But so yeah, and it's interesting that what's great about the battle sequences, and I know, like I said, we talked about how I know there's lots of complaints about the historical inaccuracies and how the battles are presented, but I think that the battles are meant to like sort of evoke one another, so it sets up expectations. Falkirk is a very similar setup on an open field and armies charging at each other, because, and especially with the way Falkirk opens up with, the whole thing with the Irish, and gives you a moment of levity, and it's like, oh, this battle's going to go good for them, and then of course it goes horribly wrong, with the betrayal of the nobles and Robert the Bruce, and then when Longshanks says, archers, and his second in command goes, sorry, sir, won't we hit our own troops? And he goes, yes, but it'll hit theirs as well. We have reserves. Attack.
Yeah.
Again, such a horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, God, but and this is, I want to take the time to like say, oh my God, what an amazing job on like costume design.
Yeah.
Like, we haven't talked about stuff like that, like the costume design and makeup and all that. It's just so brilliantly done. Especially, as far as the costume design, especially the princesses, costumes as well. And I mean, like you were saying, that this film is a technical marvel. And just with everything, it's like sort of set the standard for, everything for what we expected from epic movies. At least for me growing up, obviously there were epic movies from years gone by, but as this was the first one that really sort of hit me, growing up, it definitely set a standard. Anything else we want to talk about before we go towards the finale of
If you don't mind, because you'd mentioned how much you love Sophie Marceau and her performance, I
yeah.
kind of want to touch upon a bit about Isabella and her arc throughout the movie, because she, in some ways, particularly in the second half of the movie, she almost becomes a co-lead in some respects, and this is one of those elements when people who ding the movie for being historically inaccurate, this is one of the major things they point to, because as they rightly point out, France was a child by when William Wallace was leading his rebellion. He presumably never met her. They presumably never had any kind of romantic relationship. But setting all that aside, within the context of the movie, I think she actually works wonderfully well as both a foil to him and as kind of a representative of what could be the possibility of a better future. Because she starts out very timid. She's doesn't have a lot of experience. Obviously, she's horribly neglected by her husband, and Longshanks treats her cruelly and uses her. But she ultimately comes into her own. The scene where Longshanks sends her to negotiate with Wallace, which we later learn is nothing but a ploy to allow him to land his troops behind Wallace's position. But that scene where they meet for the first time, and she's already kind of taken with his legends, but she isn't necessarily overawed by him in the scene. She holds her own remarkably well. And there's a kind of a give and take between the two, where you can see that he challenges her, but she also challenges him. And the respect that builds between the two ends up, becoming this incredibly important element, because, not only does she become kind of an ally to him, but he helps inspire her for the better, to the point that she, in the end, has really kind of taken up her position as someone who will become this incredibly powerful figure in the after Longshanks' death, as she does in real life history. But I think that Sophie Marceau's performance in this, in a lot of these sequences where she has to kind of be very soft spoken, but also have kind of stand up to Wallace in those moments, really, it's a challenging thing for an actor to do. And I love the scene where Wallace tells her about the loss of his wife, and he's like, I've never spoken of this. I don't know why I tell you now, except I see her strength in you. One day you will be a queen, and you must open your eyes. Such a good line. And then for her, coming back in that, that sequence where you start to see, when she returns to Longshanks and she learns that he has essentially, deceived her and used her, that's the moment where she really starts to take her own initiative. And by the end, there's that wonderful moment when Wallace is in prison, and she goes to see him, and she's like, she tells the guard, who do you think will rule this kingdom when Longshanks is dead? And she's come into her own. And that's not all because of Wallace, but it is, he was the catalyst for her to kind of go on her own journey. And whether or not you think that the love story between them, if you want to call it that, is necessary, I think it actually, it's a beautiful kind of element to bring into the story, in the sense that it, what it does for both characters, helps give the movie additional emotional impact. And this is where I don't mind the historical inaccuracy, because it actually, it serves the story that's being told.
Yeah, and like I said, you just have to acknowledge that this is a fictionalized version of history, which I'm fine with, because I think it's an extremely compelling story. And I actually do, I think their love story is great. It's, it's fantastic, because it's such a hard thing to get great chemistry between actors, and the fact that you get it between Mel Gibson and Catherine McCormack so great is like, you think that sort of thing is like lightning in a bottle, but then you also get it between him and Sophie Marceau, and it's so great. And I love their love scene is so beautiful, and just his whispered, why do you help me, and the way she just turns away and says, and delivered by lesser actors, this could be like an eye-rolling line, but she says, because of the way you're looking at me now. But it's so beautiful, just the way it's executed and the way it's acted, between the two of them. And this is one of my favorite pieces of score in the entire film. And I was I was so mad for years because it wasn't on the soundtrack. The piece of music that plays, over their love scene, and then there's a montage after that sort of shows various characters and various scenes, and it was never on the soundtrack, the original soundtrack, and it wasn't until the expanded score release a few years ago that that piece finally made it on there. And I played it like over and over and over because I was so happy. It's such a beautiful piece of music. And so yeah, I love. I think they're fantastic together. And it's interesting. You said she almost is like a co-lead, because on like there's two main posters for this movie, and the one I showed earlier, but there's another one that has both of their faces on the poster and both of their names on it. So it's I think very much as they were marketing the movie, they realized that they were kind of co-leads of this film, and it's nice to see that, because you might think that whatever you think of Mel Gibson, you're probably thinking, oh, he's the big star, all the posters are just going to be him. But I like that they did that they recognized that she's a very big part of this film. But yeah, so and then kind of that can lead us into talking about the sort of finale of this film, which is just heartbreaking when Robert the Bruce finally realizes he wants to stand up and do what's right, and as he tells his father, I will never be on the wrong side again. And unfortunately, he's not as he kind of, in a lot of ways, he's almost like a Ned Stark type, in that he is too trusting of other people, and he thinks that they're gonna go along now that he's decided to do the right thing, but other people aren't. And the movie just feels so uplifting at this point, as Wallace is riding in, and Robert the Bruce is almost giddy. He's walking on the table, and then that music just turns, dark really quick, and you're like, oh no, this is where this movie is headed. And oh God, it's yeah, and then it just leads us into one of like a really brutal torture sequence that is not like it's not actually as graphic, I think, as people make out. It's more what's inferred. It's what we don't see that's all the more horrifying.
Yeah. No, and they build up. Part of the horror of it is the build up to it. Essentially, where they have Wallace brought before the tribunal with that kind of justice character who accuses him of treason, and Wallace says, I never swore allegiance to Longshanks, and the guy's like, it matters not. He is your king. Great performance by that guy, by the way.
Oh yeah, David Gant. He plays the
Yeah.
royal magistrate, and I was thinking about this as I was watching the movie, and it's what I said earlier. It's like all these great actors who play bit parts in this movie. He's in 2 scenes,
Yeah.
and but you never forget him,
Yeah.
and he's just so good, and he even goes on like a little arc throughout the torture scene. It's so wonderfully written.
He does, and he is the element by which the horror of the sequence kind of gets infused, where he is talking about confess or you'll need to be purified by pain. Do you confess? Do you confess? And he's like, then on the morrow you will receive your purification. And then you can kind of tell that he's trussing up his almost sadism in this elements of religion and power of the royal authority, and it builds into the sense that that there's almost an inevitability to this, and that is fed into by the scene where Isabella goes to visit William Wallace, and she isn't in a different movie she might have been trying to persuade him to escape, but in this case they don't even discuss it because they know there's no hope for that.
Yeah.
And Wallace is very he's accepting of his death. He's incredibly courageous about it. He has what's probably the most famous and best line in the movie, which I don't know if you want to say it because it is kind of the thing, but that every man dies, not every man really lives. It's the tagline of the movie for a reason. But
which, as getting close to 40, I'm feeling that line more than
and they build up, just going on that further, where she offers him the potion and then he refuses it, and then she makes him take it anyway and then kisses him to try to make sure that he drinks it, and then there's that moment where he spits it out, and you just kind of know that what he's about to go through, and then that incredible moment before he's wheeled out that they didn't necessarily need to put in the movie, but I think it's so important that they did, where you can hear the crowd cheering and jeering, and they cut to him in his cell, and he just kind of looks up and whispers, "I'm so afraid."
Hi, Stephanie.
Give me the strength to die well.
Yeah. And yeah, there's so many things that I could just talk about with this sequence, and the fact that I've been going on and on about the score, and through the actual torture scene, there's no score. It's just the stark, horror of what he's going through. And it's funny that you mentioned there's no intention of trying to mount some kind of escape, and going back to what I was in a movie I mentioned earlier, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, you've got his 2 best friends, who come in to observe the execution, and if this was a movie like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, they would have mounted some kind of outrageous escape plan, and shot down the ropes with an arrow.
And they even tease that further because they show Hamish and Stephen to come to the execution. Yeah. And that almost prompts you to think, oh, they're here to stage some daring escape, but it's not to be. They're just there to try and be there for him in what small way they can.
Yeah. And just the way they're standing as the execution draws to a close, and like, mercy, William, for God's sake, say it. It's just so gut wrenching, and like you say, and the build up to all the different methods of torture, and the fact that you see all the tools laid out there, and and the moments like, where the magistrate is saying enough, and kiss the seal of, the royal cloak, and you will feel no more. And then William just stands up. But then what's great is that, as, there's still more to come. They, take that awful, what would you call it?
I don't know, some kind of hook or scythe.
Hook, yeah, and like digging into him, and conceivably there's supposed to still be more to come, but instead of crying out, and we have the great, classic moment of William crying out, freedom, and that's not mercy, but in that moment, the magistrate is like, okay, that's enough, and like, just go ahead and end it, and conceivably you're thinking, but there's still more torture to come. So that's what I mean when even that character kind of like goes on, it's a very, short span of time that he's on there, but the fact that he makes that decision to go ahead and, end it, even though William has shouted something in complete defiance in that moment. I've always found that a very interesting character touch.
Yeah, it's this you mentioned, and you can probably speak to this more as an editor, but that entire final sequence where he is being tortured, and we aren't seeing it, we're focusing on his face, and then once he finally gives the defiant call of freedom, which I'm not even going to try to do justice to because only Mel Gibson could do it in that moment, but the way that they use that moment to kind of cut to all the different faces, and that, like, they cut to Isabella crying in her chambers, they cut to Longshanks with his, I presume it's meant to be his dying breath, they cut to Hamish and Stephen, who are just stunned, and then all the faces in the crowd, and then finally to, as you mentioned, that magistrate who just kind of quietly in that moment concedes defeat, that he's not going to break this man.
And they cut to Robert the Bruce as well. So brilliant. Now this I did not know. I find this like hilarious but completely understandable.
This is what you get when you make the movies in the analog age and are doing everything for real. You got to worry about stuff like this. Like, just look at the famous moment that everyone likes to call out in the Lord of the Rings, where the guy actually threw the knife at Viggo Mortensen and he had to block it with his sword. Movie making can be dangerous, folks.
Which actually, you want to, for all we've talked about, and Lord of the Rings is a very like digital effects intensive movie, but you can also look at Fellowship of the Ring as a big transitional movie as well, because if you look at, there's a big like the trilogy overall is very cohesive, but Fellowship is unique in that there is so much that like they had to depend on shooting things practically and using a lot, which they did across the board for the trilogy, but especially for Fellowship, with like practical effects like matte paintings and all that, and they were inventing their own digital CGI. They were building Weta, so they weren't really sure how much that was going to work. So much of Fellowship has its foot in the age beforehand, but it's also because they succeeded in creating all that technology, there's also a lot of digital stuff. So it's interesting that even that is sort of a transitional thing, but yeah, I completely understand like shooting this in the days of not being able to rely on that kind of digital trickery. Mel being like, yeah, we're going to figure something out for this one. Yeah, and I have actually listened to the commentary, Eric, but it's been a long time. Um, I know that it's just Mel Gibson by himself on there, so it's not, it's like there's commentary tracks that are a lot more entertaining, but he has a lot of interesting things to say about the production and filming the movie. Um, but yeah, what you were saying about the editing, I love the cross cutting. Uh, in that moment when when the axe is coming down, and that's when James Horner's music comes back in, and like that, this whole final track, because it goes right into the final sequence of the movie. It's got to be, I mean, if it's not the best like cue ever composed for a film, then it's a runner up. Because and I say that being like obsessed with Howard Shore's work on the Lord of the Rings, and I'm sure like if I go back through my, you know, on my iPhone and go through the tracks on that soundtrack, I'll be like, well, actually, but while I'm in this headspace of Braveheart, like there's nothing that beats that. It's like a 7-minute track of you know of Wallace's execution, then leading into the final scene with Robert the Bruce and the soldiers on the battlefield. It's just so utterly magical, and the way you're seeing all those moments as the axe is slowly coming down, and Wallace is looking out into the crowd and seeing Moran, and then it's showing you all the different characters, and it's just like everything's happening in slow motion, so you're still like, even as the act is cutting down, you're cutting back to Isabella, to Robert the Bruce, and it's it's so beautiful. Only beaten out in emotion by what follows, which is then when it fades to the battlefield, and you get the voiceover by Robert the Bruce, and back to what I was saying before about humor. You need injections of humor. There's been all this heavy drama, and we're about to have this big climactic ending. But then you got the the English guy on the other side going, "I hope you washed your ass this morning. It's about to be kissed by a king." And of course, the payoff is his reaction shot when the army charges. But and this is when you might be right about. I mean, for me, Mel Gibson does own this movie. Like his performance as William Wallace is nothing short of astonishing. But yeah, I have to look at Angus MacFadyen's performance as Robert the Bruce, and what he does, especially in this final scene, is just nothing short of mesmerizing. Just he does so much before he even speaks, where it's he's kept the cloth, and then he just looks back at Stephen and Hamish, uh, and again, it's just them looking at him, no words spoken, and it's so great. And then the other noble's like, "Come on, let's get it over with," and the way he just says, "Stop," and that shot is so beautiful when it shows him turning around to face the soldiers, and it like rack focuses from the English army to him. It's like you'd never see something like that in today's movie making. It's so amazing. And then just speaking, like, I can't help it, I have to say the lines where it's like, "You have bled with Wallace, now bleed with me," and and then the other noble going, "Oh." And then that famous shot, Scoff, if you want, say like, "That's one hell of a throw," and yes, it is. You can only do this in the movies, but when Hamish throws Wallace's sword, and then the music kicks up, the bagpipes, and then And then it lands and goes right into the ground, and everybody pulls out their sword, and it's Wallace, Wallace, Wallace. And then they try, oh my God. Like, there is, I'm sorry, there's no better movie scene. It's perfect.
No, I mentioned at the beginning of this stream that this was one of the first movies I remember actually like tearing up at. And I actually remember the very specific moment it was. It was the moment after the Bruce gives his speech, and then Hamish pulls out the Williams sword and then throws it up into the air. And then the moment that James Horner's score really just kicks into the highest gear, that's the moment I was just like, oh my God. and the tears fell. And just everything from the end. Yeah.
I just tears every single time. And chills, just as importantly. It's and another thing, I must have watched this movie a billion times especially with my mom, and I want to bring her up again, just because so much of my experience of watching movies and loving movies is connected to her, because she was my movie buddy, and so when it came to the movies that I've seen the most times, it naturally follows that most of the times I was watching them with her. So I just have, like, it's almost instinctual that even now when I watch this movie, and especially when I get to that ending, I just automatically feel her sitting next to me being just as much of an emotional wreck as I am. So that was beautiful, just sort of feeling that, and it helped me feel more connected to her today as I was watching this. But it's, yeah, I don't think that there is no movie ending that's like that moves me the way this one does, and there's some movie endings that are really damn good, but this is at the top for me, and there's a reason why, like, this movie is, for years before Lord of the Rings hit, this was always my number one film, like, and I was confident that nothing would ever shake that. But then of course Lord of the Rings comes, and it was such a enormous part of my life, so that naturally made it to number one. But and then there's and then Amadeus has also been like the triumvirate of my top movies has always been like Lord of the Rings, Braveheart, and Amadeus, and then Pride and Prejudice sort of threatens to sneak in there for other reasons. But even as much as I love Pride and Prejudice, like, it doesn't it doesn't stir me in the same ways as like this movie does, because this is just I always feel shaken to my core when I finish watching this movie. And anyway, so I've gone on and on about my emotional reaction to the end of this movie. So go ahead.
It's everything you said. I endorse. I don't know if I'm not gonna try to sort out my favorite movie endings of all time. I don't know where exactly this would rank. It would definitely be within the top 10 though, specifically because of that moment I mentioned with the score, and then this line that Eric is pointing out where William Wallace actually takes over the narration after Robert the Bruce has been the narrator throughout the movie, and they fought like warrior poets, they fought like Scotsmen, and they won their freedom. And then it fades out, and that is an excellent. Just everything about that is perfectly pitched. As like, different movie endings move you for different reasons. Like, I have other movie endings that move me more just because of like the kind of the quiet beauty that they end with. This is like the rousing, like, it just makes you feel like your heart is ready to soar kind of ending. And yeah, a good movie, a great movie, will leave an impression that lasts. And this is a movie that at least I can't stop thinking about for at least a time after it's over. It stays with you, and that's a credit to everyone involved, and especially the filmmaking craft of the actors, the writers, and Mel Gibson's direction. He won the Oscar for Best Director for a reason. This is one of those movies where I think the win was entirely deserved. Shawshank ending is up there too. That one's more understated, but that one is every bit as much of an emotional punch for me. It's like it's a different it's a different tone for a different style of movie.
But again, like in that case, it's Thomas Newman's score for that film, which drives so much of the emotion of the ending of that film, especially like that's one that we'll definitely have to do a stream on as well, that I can't believe I haven't covered yet. But side note, talking about the score for that movie, is that's an instance where that main theme for that film is used very sparingly throughout the movie. It's used in some key moments, but it's always played in a very sort of understated way until the end of the movie, when the orchestra just comes all out and plays that theme as those two characters see each other and going into the end credits. It's like a masterful example of restraint in a score where you're just building up to that final emotional moment. Anyway, we'll definitely get into that one whenever we cover that film. But I think that's the thing. Something and that's why it's so frustrating for me nowadays, because there's so many filmmakers that are like filmmakers and composers who are like, the best music is the music that you don't even realize is there. And like, I get what they mean, but it's like, no. Like, the best scores, I've always like recognized them as an integral part of like what's so amazing about the movie. And also they're beautiful pieces of art onto themselves that I want to listen to as soon as the movie's over. Like, I saw this movie and, instantly, like, the music stands out. And, something like Jurassic Park, you can't imagine not recognizing John Williams' score from that film. And, it's a character there. Same thing with Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, of course. And, so I like it when, when a score is bold, beautiful, and and not just hidden, underneath as part of the sound design. That's
no, they're different. They're different things. I don't get me started on the kind of pseudo intellectual film criticism where it's like the best thing about this movie is that the thing that I am smart enough to know this and you are not, because you common heathens are just swept up in the basic, the basic grandeur of an epic score. And that may be unfair, but I don't care. It's sometimes it's okay to let your heart rule your head with this kind of stuff. And if it moves you, doesn't move you, it doesn't move you. But if it does, just feel it. Just let it, sink in, because this is the kind of movie that if you're willing to buy into it, if you're willing to go on the emotional journey and just let it kind of take you away, it will reward you with a high that few movies can match. Last of the Mohicans as well. That is another movie where the score is just so incredible.
Stephanie, I will, speak of my mom, I'll never be able to watch Last of the Mohicans without thinking of her. She adored that movie, and for someone who did not normally like, she wasn't a film score buff like me. I'll just say that. Like, she had, she understood when I went on about film music, and she liked certain movie themes, but she wasn't like, super into them like me. But Last of the Mohicans, she absolutely adored the music for that film, and that's an example of like that movie like starts off with the steady drums building as the credits open up, and then the title Last of the Mohicans comes on, and that score just comes out in full force. Like that's a movie that says this is the music to our film. uh, it's going to be a big important part. Recognize this theme because it's going to be with you through the next couple hours, and that's what I'm talking about. Like that's that's music that's not buried underneath as a supporting player. Like that, I mean, that's why I'm such a lover of film music. It's the it's a big integral part of movie making that moves me. And so I like music that, there's a lot of great scores that are more minimalist, but nothing better to me than a film score that announces itself in a good way, that, where it's so beautiful and breathtaking that it's a part of the movie that you can't separate it from the film. And James Horner's work on Braveheart is very much that. I will never get over the fact that it didn't win the Oscar for Best Original Score, which just, again, this is not going to be a discussion about, the Oscars and what they, and their relevancy or whatnot, but that should tell you everything you need to know right there.
Yeah, no, and but I do want to comment on it because this is a movie that actually did win Best Picture.
Yeah,
and I feel like in recent years there has been on whatever they call themselves, Film Twitter, who I have a lot of issues with. I'll just say they seem to view this movie as like not a good winner of Best Picture, and I just could not disagree more. This is the kind of movie that like the Best Picture Oscar was made for.
Yeah. Well, and there has been a movement even within the industry to sort of, I always say that they got shell shocked when they let Return of the King sweep the Oscars. It was like that was too big of a populist movie, so they've had to retreat back into their shells for like the next 20, 30 years. But yeah, I do kind of miss the days of the big timeless epics, winning Best Picture, which, when I was growing up, it was, like the awards went to movies like Braveheart, Titanic, Gladiator, and then Lord of the Rings, so I do have a nostalgia for that. But yeah. So I guess that takes us through the movie. There's obviously probably so much more we could have delved into, but is there anything that you want to touch on that we didn't get to?
No, this is an excellent movie. It's a rare kind of movie that it stands on its own. It stands the test of time, and I will always be happy to revisit. Although I will add a humorous grace note to that, in the sense that when I was looking at the Wikipedia page for this movie, just to refresh myself on a few basic things in terms of like the behind the scenes crew members, I looked. Did you know that this movie actually has an unofficial sequel?
Yes.
Yeah. Angus MacFadyen, who plays Robert the Bruce in this film, actually reprises his role as Robert the Bruce in this movie that came out in 2019 called Robert the Bruce. And I had no idea that this was a thing. I almost watched it before we did this stream, but then I decided to hold off because I'm like, I just want to focus on the actual movie itself, because Apparently, this Robert the Bruce film is not quite as epic as Braveheart. It's a smaller story. But I will say that I just found that humorous. And I was like, this is the type of movie that, you know, doesn't need a sequel. And I'm like, actually, it does have a sequel. Because I'd seen, as Eric Morrow points out in the chat, I'd seen Outlaw King, which stars Chris Pine and kind of picks up Robert the Bruce's story, you know. And I actually thought that was a pretty good movie, but it's, you know, it's telling a different, you know, story. And in that case, Robert the Bruce, you know, he's on his own hero's journey in that film, whereas this one is kind of the prelude to his hero's journey. So,
and Outlaw King also has Florence Pugh.
Yes, and she's excellent. She's excellent in it.
Yeah, that was before she was, you know, a big deal. I just remember watching that and being like, oh damn, this, you know, this actress is really good in this. And yeah, no, that's a good movie. I like that. I haven't seen the unofficial Robert the Bruce sequel, mostly because you know, not that it would tarnish the movie, but I'm like, do I really want to see that? But I don't know. It might be worth taking a look at just for the hell of it. I will say, speaking of Angus MacFadyen, as I said earlier, I kind of wish he'd been in more stuff over the years, but I just recently saw him in the 7th season of the show Outlander. If anybody watches that show, he played Jamie's cousin in that, who fights for the British, and he was damn good. Not, you know, kind of a smaller part, but he played he had quite a good chunk of material in the mid-season finale that just dropped a couple weeks ago, and he was absolutely fantastic. It's the type of thing that was like, see, this guy is really damn good. He should have been getting parts left and right after this, but yeah. Yeah, Eric, I've been talking for a while about doing streams on Outlander, so we'll have to see about that. Have you managed to watch Outlander?
That one you might have to do without me, because I have not seen Outlander. My parents have actually watched that show, but I just fell behind, and now I think I'm 7 seasons behind. That might be a tall ask to catch up on, unless it's like years down.
Well, that's why, like, Laura and Kate have been, you know, for like the past year or more, been on me to watch Gilmore Girls, and that's a 7-season show, and I'm like, I really want to, and I've watched the first couple episodes, and I do think I'd be able to get into it, but it's like, it's so hard. I've got like 25 to 30 shows that are on my to watch list, and I'm like, the priority has to be stuff that is like shorter episode orders, so that I can try and cut down on that list. But I'm going to get to that sooner or later. But yeah, no, I've had I've got people who I know are chomping at the bit to talk Outlander with me, so you'll be off the hook for that one.
Yeah. You can save it for a week that I can't do the stream. Just plug that one in there.
Yeah, and actually, for anybody who does want to see me in the meantime talk about that show, I did a guest spot on the channel Gates Dorelia, where I talked to Cecilia about that show. We kind of did an overview of the entire series, so you can find that on the YouTube page. Just go to the main page. I've got a little section that's called guest appearances, and so if you want to check that out, her and I also did another stream where she had me on to talk about Pride and Prejudice, because I will look for any excuse to talk about that movie like 5 billion times over. I think we'll probably end up doing another stream at some point of about Pride and Prejudice. We'll have to invite AR on for that one, just so we can change things up a little bit from last time. But yeah, so yeah, Eric, Glory's another good one. Another great James Horner score. Which, by the way, I'll just close off by saying, obviously, as I've gone on and on about it on this stream, James Horner's work on this film is one of my favorites of all time. But I have to say, like, overall, even though, like, Howard Shore's work on Lord of the Rings is probably my favorite score of all time, but James Horner stands as my favorite composer ever, just because I think his scores they're very classical, but they're also highly emotional, which was always a trademark of his music. Whether it was this or, the score for Titanic, stuff like The Rocketeer. I'm a huge fan of that movie, and then the score for that film is great too. And he did Star Trek 2 and 3, and just The Land Before Time, which was probably a foundational musical score for me, even though I was only like 4 years old when that movie came out. So I guarantee you I didn't go see that and be like, this is an incredible musical score. But I do think it was very, like, subconsciously, I think I recognized that, something about that movie was making me feel things. And a lot of that is down to the music. So yeah, it's just I want to say rest in peace to James Horner, because that may have hit me harder than any quote unquote celebrity death that there's ever been, because he played such an instrumental part of my sort of emotional growth as I was growing up. His music was so important to me. So yeah, miss you, James. Wish you were still here composing music, because you were one of the greats.
He was. No one's ever topping John Williams for me, but James Horner is just right there in terms of just outstanding body of work as a composer and indelible themes, of which this is probably the greatest in my opinion.
Yeah. I know he did get a lot of flack while he was around for the fact that he would sometimes copy his own work. But it's like, you have to come up with the stuff in the first place to copy yourself. So
yeah. I don't believe in self-plagiarism. I think that, let him rip himself off as many times as he wanted to.
Yeah, and to be honest, now I kind of rejoice every time I watch one of his movies and I hear that 3-note danger motif that pops up. Like, every time there's a villain in a movie he stars, it's it's you hear that and you're like, it's a James Horner score. So yeah, but yeah, Christine, I didn't even do that on purpose. So anyway, I just want to make sure I got a little bit of James Horner praise in there, because I know I didn't do much of that throughout the stream.
Just a tad.
So just wrapping up, classic movie. I'm glad we got to talk about it, and that's we even went over 2 hours. Folks, I'll work myself back up to those 3-hour streams. You just got to let me warm up a bit, and we'll get there. So yeah, one of my favorite films of all time. We're really glad to be able to talk about it with you, Jared, and to talk about it with you guys. I want to thank you guys for showing up and having a talk with me. And this is just a lot of fun. This is why I do it, because I just I have a real passion for talking about this stuff, and it makes me feel really good to be able to share that with people. So yeah, before I keep rambling on, next week, make sure you guys come back. We'll be doing a 20th anniversary celebration of Pirates of the Caribbean with AR, and first, official return of the Knights of Kira. So we'll be doing that. And then the week after that, we'll be diving back into Ahsoka, talking about parts 3 through 5. So you come back for that. And honestly, like, took all my willpower, Jared, to be like, oh, screw our schedule. Let's just talk about part 3 of Ahsoka this week, because I had so much fun with that. So I'm looking forward to our discussion of that. And yeah, so anything you want to throw out there before we wrap up, Jared?
Nope. I'm looking forward very much to next week's discussion, and to have AR join us for a celebration of a movie that we all love dearly. I'm looking forward to continuing these streams, and in the meantime, I'll still, if you need to find me anywhere, not that you necessarily need to, I'm gonna probably, college football season has started, so my feed on the website formerly known as Twitter is probably going to be mostly about sports going forward, but I'll still sneak a few movie references in there, and then come back next week to see us talk about Pirates of the Caribbean, because I think that'll be a blast.
Just real quick before we go, just want to pop this up. Hold on, let me type this. If any of you watching, are into some of the stuff we've been talking about, and would like to join us for further conversation, we are part of a group called Here Be Dragons. You can, I'm actually co-host on the Here Be Dragons YouTube channel that I do with my good brother and sister, Stephen Stark and Nessie the Questing Beast. And we have a Slack group where lots of our friends, including Jared and, some people who have been in the chat, where we just hang out and we, talk about different stuff. We've got like different channels, for like watch parties, and, we talk about movies and books and whatever else comes up. One of our members, Anna, is great about posting memes every day, so it gets us talking. But if any of you are interested in joining us, just send an email to we3dragons@gmail.com, and one of us will get you in the group. We'd love to have the more the merrier. So yeah. I'll leave that up there. Anybody wants to jot it down. But yeah, so aside from that, I think that's it. Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you anybody who's coming to watch this after the fact. Like I said, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so. And if you enjoyed this, just share the stream. I think it's going to take a little bit of time to sort of spread the word that that we're back up and running. So would love any help if you guys could do that. Okay, I have talked long enough. So with that, I'll just say see you guys next week, and hope you have a lovely night. Bye.
Good night, everyone.